You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
So Hayden, I know you can see my camera. I've transitioned from the closet. No longer in a closet. I'm in a professional studio now. For those watching on the video portion. No, it's still a closet, but work in progress. I am, putting up some decorations. It's a big step for me. We got a comment, someone saying it's obvious that you're in a closet, Brendan. And I was like, this is my bedroom, sir. How dare you? But yeah, working on it. Got a little bit of scene, got some lights. I feel like a real YouTuber right now. So it's a moment. Hayden, always the sort of luminescent. That was the word that was about to come out of my mouth. Was luminescent. I was going to say you have a luminescent background, but same background as always. How has your life been? How has your life been in Flesh and Blood? What do you think about the meta? How do you feel about the upcoming Pro Tour Baltimore? I know you're not going to be attending, but I do think you'll be watching, which is fantastic. Let me know how bad I am on camera and Twitch chat, please. But what do you think about the meta right now? What's been going on?
So just keep it simple to start with on the pod. I mean, life's pretty good. Definitely playing some Flesh and Blood at the moment. Meta is really interesting. I think we're going to talk about it a lot in this pod because what we've seen with the Battle Hardened last weekend is another really diverse top 8. Not so much maybe a reasonably diverse showing of heroes, but the sort of conversion to top 8 was really mixed. And I think that is going to lead to quite an interesting meta for the Pro Tour. I think the narrative has been that it's going to be really open. I was listening to Instant Speed podcast this week with Blake and some dude, and the guest, you wouldn't believe it. This guest, arrogant. No, I'm kidding. Brendan as the guest this week. I know you said that you thought this was going to be potentially the most wide open meta we've had for a Pro Tour or a pro level event, and I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I think there's a couple of really big players in this format, and I think the meta will sort of converge a bit as we get to the Pro Tour, which you can pepper me with questions once we get to the pod, but I think it's a very interesting sort of lead-in.
So I don't think it's going to be like, every single deck is equally represented, but I do think if you look at Pro Tour number 1, which is it was like 3 decks. You look at Pro Tour number 2, it was 1 deck.
It was a bit more wide. It was a bit more wide at Pro Tour 2, though.
I feel like it was I feel like people who were playing Broad were throwing, but I could be wrong. So yeah, I feel like compared to those, but I do have to ask you, since you did listen to this in speed, did you hear my jokes? I did make some jokes about you. I hope that you would hear them. Flake was doing his accent. Oh,
his British accent that he's trying to pass off as Australian. It was terrible. If you haven't listened to Instant Speed this week, is this even a podcast at this point? We're talking about other podcasts, but Flake was just talking about whatever he wanted to talk about how bad I am at Mario Kart, which is true. I'm not that great at Mario Kart, but I am. First of all, I'm not Australian. I'm from New Zealand, so I felt a little bit insulted, I would say, and also I don't sound like that.
Not
also Uber. The accent of Uber was just
spot on,
atrocious.
Okay.
Anyway, Week in Flesh and Blood.
Yep.
Should we talk about that?
Go for it.
I've been testing.
Yeah,
I've been playing some Classic Constructed. Not as much as I had been in the previous weeks. Now that we're getting closer to the PT, obviously not attending, so it's a bit less of a focus for me than it would be had I been planning to be at the PT and testing very, religiously, getting out there morning and evening, getting a lot of hours in. I'm pretty settled on the deck I think I would play if I was going to the PT. I think list-wise, probably not quite, but I plan to kind of solidify what I would play at the PT and share that list next week before the PT, which I think we can discuss then. And I'll try and put up a video if time allows, if I feel like I have enough to say. Otherwise, we might just kind of post the list and talk about it briefly next week on the pod, Brendan. Draft. I'm going to try and do a draft tonight. I drafted... When did I last draft? I drafted in the top 8 of my skirmish 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago. That was the last time I drafted. So I definitely want to get more drafts in. I think this format is, again, very, very interesting. And I'm actually really excited to watch the draft portion of Baltimore, just to see what kind of... I am.
Yeah, I know. It's just it's not going to be recorded, unfortunately.
No, the games.
Yeah.
But also, I think it's such a miss that
it is.
The drafts aren't recorded.
It is.
Which we're what? This is effective pro event number 4, and we're not recording drafts.
It's intentional, by the way. I don't know if shit, I might not be supposed to say that, but anyway, we know that they haven't been wanting to record drafts. Because when I was a player, which I still am a player, but when I was top 8 drafting in Dallas, I was like, oh, you guys want to record the draft? Like, it's my favorite part of watching. And they're like, nope, LSS does not want us to do it for tournament integrity, and I think that's public knowledge. So I kind of disagree with the effect of tournament integrity on so a willing participant to stream their draft, because I think that it adds content and you can follow said participant through the rounds. But yeah, excited to watch the games, Hayden, right? What are you excited about?
I am, because I think people have different takes on this format. I was talking to Alan Lau from Hong Kong on Limited Time Only this week, who is a very, very good player. Someone who doesn't like peace of mind, just doesn't like the card in the format, doesn't think the play patterns that they like to sort of engage in with this draft format, doesn't want peace of mind in their decks. So, I think that's really interesting, because a lot of other players, I spoke to Chu Heng the week before from Singapore, who's a very, very good limited mind, feels opposite. And I think I feel opposite to that. So I just think that we're going to get into the games. People are going to have different takes on how to have drafted and play these heroes. There's 6 heroes. There's different ways you can play each of these heroes. I think card quality is pretty similar across the board. It doesn't feel like Uprising, where it was like, you had these terrible yellows and these cards that felt pretty unplayable. It feels like, for the most part, you can, in the right decks, all the cards can be playable. So, and they all have a role somewhere, which is really interesting. So I'm excited to see that it's more generics, things like that. So
yeah, I just follow up on that and ask you a question in terms of like hero power level. I know you've probably talked about this quite enough, but just to sum it up in terms of like, because you talked about Uprising, it was definitely like Fi's up here. Some people disagree and they prefer to draft Dramai or Icelander, but it did seem like Fi was just like easier to draft at the very least, and you could get away with more players drafting Fi at the table. So it seemed like a somewhat safer pick in a draft pod. How do you feel about that that concept in Outsiders draft specifically? Do you feel like there's any heroes that maybe crop up as like, this one's a bit easier to draft than the others, and a different hero that contrary to that is like, you really need the pieces to make this work at all?
Yeah, there is, but it's less polarizing than Uprising. So I think the kind of common consensus, and I think definitely the consensus of myself and the guests I've had on Limited Time Only, is that Assassin is a little bit of that. It can support the most players at the table because of card pool, because of the ability to use generics and weaker generics in a better way. And because of how Spider Smites works, it means that some blues that you wouldn't want to see in your Ranger deck or even your Ninja deck, for instance, have a home, have a place. So I think Assassin is that. I think, I talked about this again on Limited Time Only this week. 4-2-2 kind of feels like roughly what tables are going to split out like, somewhere there or thereabouts, or 3-3-2s. So typically 4 Assassin, 2 Ninja, 2 Ranger feels like what can be supported the best when it comes to this draft format. So you might think, well, that means Assassin is more like in the fire camp, it's more powerful. It's not so much that, as it is just that you can support more decks, I think, with the Assassin cards, because of the interchangeability and the sort of the closeness of card quality. On the flip side of that, like you talked about, if I'm drafting Azalea, for instance, I do not want another Azalea drafter at the table. The cards you need are so much more specific. You are in a bit of a Dromai spot to that degree, where, if you've got, think about the last format, you had 3 Dromais at the table, even 2 sometimes. It felt really, really bad. And it feels similar for Azalea because there's particular cards you want. So yeah, there's a bit of it, but it's a lot less polarizing. And I think because of the generics, they open longer as well, which is a real benefit. Again, one thing, I just wish we had 15 card packs, but that's the thing.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I know we sort of picked up on that initially when we saw the product sheet, but it does look like it has translated the way we thought it would, where it's, the additional card does add, it feels like it adds more depth, right? It opens up more playability to some heroes that are a bit harder to draft. It also makes the wheel feel a bit more relevant sometimes. Just got more tools to work with, I think. So for my week in Flesh and Blood, obviously, you and I just got I guess you could call games. We were playing with Sasha, and we kind of degenerated and just talking about whatever we end up talking about. But for me, I'm preparing to cast the Pro Tour from the analysis side of things, and I would say that this one in particular is a bit more overwhelming than the others, because the diversity of heroes being represented in these top 8s. I also, post a meeting with a production crew. I know that this is generally a thing at tournaments, but at CFB, the casters were actually the ones usually kind of picking the feature matches. I don't think that's going to be the case this time, and I know that they actually prioritize deck diversity early in a tournament. So it's going to be really on me to know the wacky decks in particular. So I'm probably going to be on those, casting those. And then the main thing that's concerning for me is just kind of like funky rules interactions, which we ran into in some of our Talishar games. It's just that they're not hard, but the way that people play in paper, so like they play Come to Fight, they leave Come to Fight on the board, and then they use Azuri's ability. It's confusing, right? Especially when you're trying to think about a bunch of things. So yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit nervous for this one. Where the last one I wasn't nervous at all, but I have like a super hard boot camp coming up this upcoming week.
Yeah, there's a lot more happening in this current format. There's a lot more, even in draft format. Like there's just a lot more rules interactions. Where if you haven't seen them, then they're not intuitive necessarily, or you just might need a second. And I guess that's harder when you're in the booth, So there's definitely some quick fire ones, which I think we talked about a couple this morning. We refreshed the interaction between Ponder and you can destroy, for instance, and Inertia. I wanted to ask you a question though. Okay, you sit down round one, you're in the booth. I don't know, Tan and Grace is next to you, or Blake, Brian, someone's next to you. What's the nightmare matchup? Like, what are you worried about being paired round one? Like, what do you not want to see because you maybe aren't quite familiar yet at the moment? Maybe
yeah.
This week
we'd have to take the knowledge that I have right now. I'd say it's definitely Assassin. Probably be like a more off meta Assassin deck because something like that. Just because, I'm not a big fan of that hero, to be honest. I haven't played it for my personal pleasure very much. And it's just like, it has some wacky interactions as well. So yeah, that's the one where I'd be like, ugh, I'd be kind of a groan. Also, CFB had this custom program they had on a small iPad so the card images were done by the casters. That's not going to happen at this one. Yeah, so like the card image thing was also a resource to quickly look up cards in like a very, succinct database. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing I'd be most worried about. I think that, ultimately, fast forward a week and a half from now or whatever, I'm going to be very comfortable with every single card's name and text on the card. It's more these like niche ruling things. And then the way that players represent their board states on paper can be pretty confusing.
You'll be fine. You got plenty of time to play some more games.
And, I could just bullshit it, At the end of the day, I just, Twitch chat will forgive me. Just
Twitch chat notoriously known as a very forgiving group of people.
Very forgiving. So. Yep.
I'll be on there spamming you, don't you worry.
All right, news time.
Yeah, let's talk news. I mean, first of all, Pro Tour Baltimore and Calling Baltimore is next weekend. So by the time this pod drops, we are a week away from the Pro Tour. Very exciting. Obviously, Brendan will be there going. I was going to say harass. Go and say hello. Don't say hello. Pop in. And, of course, he'll be on coverage. I'll be watching from home. Very excited. And skirmish season is in full swing as well. So, like I was saying, got to play a limited skirmish. There is sealed plus boosters draft top 8 skirmishes, but also blitz in a big part of this season. And, Brendan, I don't know if you've seen some of these results, but Icelander is doing fairly well so far when it comes to skirmish season and blitz.
Yep, Hayden. I'll take you a little history lesson. Not too long ago, where a good friend of mine named Kano actually died for the sins of Icelander in blitz, and it looks like it's going to happen once again. Yeah, Icelander. I'm not going to take credit for this because you said it, but I also believe it, and I think that Icelander in a format like Blitz is just a better wizard after Aether Wildfire has been banned, but is also better than every other deck, I guess, as well. Stormstriders is very powerful. We've known that Icelander, in like this condensed format where the life totals are so low, Stormstriders becomes stronger, right? Like the sort of effect of it is felt a lot more. So yeah, Icelander absolutely just destroying skirmish season right now. Do you have sort of any stats for me in terms of how dominant it actually is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's gonna living legend is what's gonna happen. So, it looks like Ultimate Icelander will probably living legend in this skirmish season. So, skirmish season is something that I haven't really seen be talked about, but we have the this weekend coming up. And Ultim is 6 points away, so that's 3 wins away from Living Legend. And Icelander is 12 points, 6 wins away. And for context, so far, Icelander has won 71 events. So at this season, so it's 2 points for a skirmish win, and we have. I want to double check that. Yeah, 2 points for a skirmish win, And we have 142 points to Icelander's name, credited to Icelander's name for the season so far. So 71 wins. Ultim's put in 21 wins, so it's pretty close. In terms of just some of the other heroes that have been winning, Kasai has seen some pretty good results. Yeah, your favorite. 18 wins by the looks of it, or 19 wins. Chain with 18 wins. Dash with 19 wins. So those are the heroes that have been performing pretty well in the Blitz sort of skirmish season. They're the top. I mean, Icelander is just so far ahead. It's winning triple what some of these other heroes are winning. But then it's Icelander so far, Ultim right up in there, Kasai, Chain, Dash, and then Kano actually. So, as much as we talk about Wildfire being banned, I think Kano's still very, very powerful and potent, obviously. It's putting up results, 16 wins to Kano's name. Prism not far behind there. And then just some shout outs. I mean, Azuri's been doing fairly well. Has won 8 events. Other heroes that are with Benji won a skirmish. Riptide's won a couple. Zalia, Yoji, Dardadol won a skirmish. So yeah.
I remember Michael Fang gave me that deck for the Dallas Battle Hardened, the second one, the one that was Blitz. And I remember playing it. Literally, I had not played the deck at all.
Icelander, right?
Yeah, he gave me the basically the deck that was in his backpack because I didn't bring one. I wasn't playing to play Blitz because I thought it sucked at the time. And yeah, I was like, this is the most broken thing I've been doing in Flesh and Blood, and it's so easy to do. And I think we're seeing that sort of come to fruition as his deck becomes so dominant. In the skirmish season, do you think that? You think it's just going to be a living legend solution, not a banning?
Well, it's going to hit Living Legend. Icelander will be Living Legend this season. It's 12 points away. So we'll see Viserai, Ultimate, Icelander be... I mean, and of course it's not guaranteed, but based on run rate, it would be very, very outside of the expected for Icelander and Ultimate to not achieve Living Legend this weekend.
I have a good question then. Do you think the Storm Strider should have remained banned?
Should have remained banned? Probably not, I think. It's tough. I think the way that LSS have looked at balancing blitzes around key events, so where they've put blitz into the spotlight, at a tier 4 event like Worlds, they've made sure to balance the format a bit more. And then they've obviously made the decision that for the a more general population for events at tier 1 level like skirmish, they want to let people play with their cards, right? I mean, Crown Seeds obviously is still banned, but isn't seeming to hinder Ultim. So, yeah, it's tough. I mean, Kano's obviously still winning events, but it looks a little bit more reasonable. 16 events as opposed to the 70-odd that Icelanders won this current skirmish season. Might indicate that once Icelander goes, maybe Stormstrider is okay. My feeling is that Kano is really, really powerful in Blitz either way. It's worth noting Kano is, so it's Viserai, Ultimate, Icelander. These will be, we assume, the 3 heroes Living Legend. After that, it's then Ira and Kano. They are the next sort of top 2, and that stems back to some historical Living Legend points as well. But
yeah, I think that Icelanders would still might have the number 1 spot on Snapdragon Scalers. To be honest, I think that deck is pretty good. Like in terms of Blitz, I don't know if it would be the overwhelmingly best deck, but I think it's not. Still might be eking out over Kano if Stormtrotters is gone. Because
I mean, it would be better than Kano for sure, but I mean, Storms. I don't think it'd be top tier. I mean, you've lost Hypothermia. You've lost
there's the
Ice
other
Vein. Yeah, there's been so many cards. I mean, it has the most cards and
additional cards.
It's Icelander's hits. So
turns out playing both sides of the turn cycle is pretty good, eh?
Yeah. Getting bookended turns, getting to play on your turn, then your opponent's turn to finish off a game in a format where people have maximum 20 life is huge. So yeah, we will see. I mean, that is skirmish season. 1 week to go. I'm going to head out and play a Blitz skirmish this weekend. Looking forward to that. Not sure what I'll play yet. Probably need to sleeve up a deck and decide though. Elsewhere in the news, we have Battle Hardened Richmond happen over the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Congrats to Pat Eshke, who won that event on Ultim. It was an all Ultim final, really setting some, maybe some benchmarks for what we might expect come next weekend and the Pro Tour. Brody, of course, made another top 8. It's Battle Hardened, so you just assume Brody's going to be in that top 8 in North America. There was some good representation. 7 heroes represented, so Ultim was the only double up, and it was an all Ultim final, which was interesting. But yeah, congrats to Pat on the win there. I think that kind of does it for the news. I mean, yeah, that's That's all I have to say on the news front, really.
Yeah, we're always going to talk about the main topic of the pod, but just so we can set precedent, because I think it's pretty interesting, and we're going to compare it to the most recent results. But it was Oldhim, Jeremiah, Azalea, Azuri, Lexi, Bravo, Dash. So, I mean, there's a few in there that I'm just like, what the hell is going on? Which is
This is representation from Battle Hardened, right?
Yeah, the Battle Hardened top 8.
Top 8.
Yeah, and it's actually quite interesting in comparison to even the most recent Battle Hardened before that, where Brody Spock did win on Azalea. But yeah, alas, that is the main topic. Do we have a Command and Cookouts question this week, sir?
We do. We have a question, which I think you'll like. It's a bit off topic. It's a bit not so much Flesh and Blood related, but more card game related. And this comes from Alexander Snell. Did I get that right? Close enough. With the question is, Brendan, you are pretty outspoken on Lorcana, having your own podcast on Lorcana as well. Or on Twitter in the week, Hayden, that you played some games with Lorcana as well. I want to know what you both think of Lorcana as a game, and do you think it has a place alongside the likes of Flesh and Blood?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I mean, you're the Lorcana guy.
So we played a lot. Yeah, we played a lot. We played enough. Let me say that. A lot is a weird word, but we played enough. Lorcana in its current iteration, which is, we have, like, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 cards, enough to play playable decks of every single color combination. Lorcana feels like a card game made by suits. It feels like a card game made by corporations. And what do I mean by that? It just feels, to be honest, and yeah, if you're sitting here and you're a big Lorcana truther and you're like, this is the future of card games, and you're just stuck on that and you're like, Brendan, you don't have all the cards? Yeah, I know. But a lot of these cards are printed on the front of the box of a lot of starter decks, a lot of like the marquee art, and you can discern a lot from playing playable decks. It just feels like it's very simple, of course, and we expected that. And simple things aren't necessarily bad. There can be a lot of complexity added into something that is inherently simple because of competitive play and just competing against other human beings that can add depth in and of itself. But Lorcana, in terms of how it's designed, is like it has taken a lot of elements for other card games, and it feels like it's stripped a lot of the essence out of those card games. It also has a lot of elements that are, in my opinion, fundamentally archaic, like completely asynchronous turns, damage counters, which are actually not that bad. I'm very much against damage counters, persistent damage in a game that's played in paper, but it doesn't come up that much because combat is not actually really a thing in Lorcana. Combat is like some sort of like secondary or tertiary element that happens because of like the tempo of what I would consider reaping, or what is reaping from Keyforge, but is questing in Lorcana. I think that's the name for it. But yeah, like combat is not like a thing that you're actually really thinking about and engaging in. It's just kind of a super linear of like this like EV evaluation of like, do I trade this and then lose it to, the opponent's whatever they have represented on board, and I cash it in now. There is a push and pull, which I think is important. I think that is the foundation of what makes card games fun. There is like, someone else is ahead, you're ahead. There's a trade-off. It's like, do I cash in this resource now, potentially lose it, or do I save it? I think that's interesting. I think that the art is cool. I think that the color identity is cool as well. Like, there's a lot of flavor, but ultimately the gameplay was, Hayden, I would probably describe it as uninspiring. Does that mean that I'm just going to, before I pass it over, does that mean that I won't play it and I won't have a lot of fun with it? Absolutely not. I think that, if all of my best friends are playing it, if it's just a popular game, and that ultimately, I think that make or break it for Lorcana is, for me, 100% the card design. The card design it's got to hold up this game, because the rules and the base interaction does not. If you get a bunch of commons together in Flesh and Blood and you just slap them together and you play against a friend, it's fundamentally fun because the game is fun. The game is well designed. Like, Ira decks are a great experience. Lorcana's not that. So I think that there has to be card design that adds layers onto this sort of lack of complexity that exists in the game. But yeah, ultimately, I think if my friends are playing it, and if there is, a level of depth that is added to the game through high level play, then that will be fun. If the game is balanced, I think it will be fun. Those are my thoughts.
I guess part of the reason for choosing this question for me as well was Flesh and Blood podcast, obviously, Brendan. And I think one of the things playing this game, so I played a bit of Disney Lorcana the other day with what was first available next to Sasha. And my kind of, I guess, takeaway was just comparing it to Flesh and Blood, just what a solid game Flesh and Blood is from a design perspective, from how interesting the principles are and what the game feels like. And that made me feel good, because I think recently, I think it's partly this is not going to the Pro Tour, but my kind of my enjoyment for Flesh and Blood has maybe been a little bit lower in the constructed format. I've been really enjoying Limited and been trying to play as much as possible. But with constructed, I've been a little bit less in it than maybe I have been previously. And I think a big part of that is just not going to be at the Pro Tour. So my testing has been a bit more exploratory rather than necessarily focused, for instance. And I think when I played a few games of other games over the past week, I played a bit of Magic, for instance, while I was back home. I did a few Cube drafts, which I love Cube draft because, firstly, draft, which is my favorite format, and then Cube, I think, is quite interesting as well, especially when they're sort of custom cubes people have come up with. That was great, but also I think just again that and Disney Lorcana and comparing it back to Flesh and Blood, I just have continued appreciation for what this game is. I think in the design aspects, and yeah, my kind of takeaways are pretty similar to you about Lorcana. I quite like I'm going to call it the Digivolve mechanic. If you've played any of this, I can't remember Shift, which is because there is a lot of mechanics from other games that are kind of been sandwiched into Lorcana, and most of them work okay, I think, and it's a reasonably clean game, which is good. Like you were talking about, the damage counters feel a little bit awkward, but they're actually kind of fine. The kind of total lore and things like that. But yeah, I had fun, and I think the property is obviously really cool. You have a really great IP, and I think that's going to support what this game is. I'll be interested to see what happens with it, but I'm not going anywhere from playing Flesh and Blood, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think that it's just really interesting looking at Flesh and Blood as the benchmark of a great card game, and then playing something like Lorcana. I think Lorcana is better than sealed chaos Magic, right? Which is really clunky and I mean, depends. Sealed, right? So these, I don't know. It depends on obviously how you enjoy Magic, but I think that underpowered, non-synergistic Magic, to me, I don't find as enjoyable as constructed. That's player by player. But I think that Lorcana feels like that, but then they've solved some of the mana issues, but those have been solved for 20 years. People know how to solve that issue. So yeah, they just took a lot of aspects from other card games, and I think that ultimately it is just card design and balance. If the game is well balanced and the card design is exciting, then you don't need complicated interactions and complicated rules to make a great game. You don't. So still a lot to see, but I was surprised. I was like, wow, they really played this one safe, is what it felt like. And yeah, I think Flesh and Blood is a freaking awesome game, dude. Flesh and Blood is, in my opinion, the best card game on the market right now. I think that it can only be rivaled by Marvel Snap, which is, I don't even think they're in the same genre, to be honest. I don't even think they're in the same genre at all. But yeah, Flesh and Blood, I think if they do things right, this is the best card game around.
Yeah, there's always, I played a bit of Digimon when it came out as well. There's always things I pick up and I think are really interesting, and there's so many, I think a lot of games that come out recently in particular have really cool aspects. So Snap, I really like the fast-paced gameplay. I love the lane-based nature of it. There's some things I really friggin' hate about that game as well. Not to mention, not even starting on the economy. Just the game itself I have issues with. And then Digimon, I played a bit of that, and I was like, yeah, cool. I really like this resource system. It's a back and forth resource system where you use resources, which pushes resources to your opponent, for instance. Lorcana, I was like, okay, this kind of mechanic of shift and the kind of idea of reaping lore is quite interesting. But ultimately, it's just what's the total gameplay? And I think come away from the weekend with appreciation for the total gameplay aspect of Flesh and Blood.
Yeah.
And hence why I'm excited to see kind of Baltimore unfold.
Yeah. I mean, Flesh and Blood, I think is, well, I actually want to, let's open up the main topic with that. Hayden, do you think that, so Flesh and Blood, the class constructed meta and Baltimore does look to be diverse. If you look at the past two Battle Hardened tournaments, it's an extremely diverse top 8, Hayden. Do you think that a diverse meta, like what we've seen right now in class constructed, leads to a better, on average, a better gameplay experience than a more narrow meta that's dominated by 3 decks that are maybe in sort of a rock, paper, scissors-esque kind of format? So we got to use some examples. We'll use Pro Tour Baltimore, the upcoming meta for class constructed, versus Proto number 1. Which kind of what kind of in what scenario, in what environment do you have more fun as a player? Because I think that your answer and my answer is actually not what people would think.
PT1 by like a massive margin. And the problem I have with these, far out, we're starting on the we're starting on this note. Why did you start with this question? I guess my problem with this idea of wide open meta is that a lot of these decks just do the same thing. They're quite homogenous, I think, which is not really what I want from Flesh and Blood. And what I quite like about, yes, I understand the criticism of events like PT1, even PT2, with kind of the narrowness of maybe the hero pool and what is viable to play. But all of those heroes felt really, really different. All of the game plans felt really, really different. And I think right where we are now is it's a lot of this kind of value proposition and the some of the power creep we've started to see with kind of the value of cards, I think has made it so that the decks feel a little bit more similar. The heroes and their play styles feel a little more similar, which is not something that I particularly enjoy. I would say like the micro sort of, there's some micro interactions that are interesting, that are different between every single hero, but the macro feels quite similar, which is not really where I want to be honest. And I miss kind of heroes like Chain and Prism for that reason, which sounds a little bit silly, but when it comes to gameplay, that's why I've been enjoying Limited, I think, because there is a lot happening, but also they're very different between the 3 classes and their playstyle, and you're kind of you're playing across those. It's no wider than the 6 heroes. It's no wider than the 3 classes. And I felt with Classic Constructed kind of in my testing, and maybe this is a little bit of why I've kind of been a little bit more disconnected. Maybe it is partly not going to be at the PT. Maybe it is partly just in my enjoyment of the format. It's so wide now, and I think that is daunting to start with. And then also sometimes you pick things up and you go, wow, this feels like kind of similar. What's my kind of incentive to play it? So yeah, it's interesting.
So my reason for asking this question is that I just want to address or like sort of poke at the thesis that the more diverse the color or the hero pie, the better. And I genuinely don't believe that's true. It's not that this meta is bad. It's just that I look back at something like PT number 1 and PT2, and I think that as a competitor, those were much more enjoyable to prepare for, try to crack, and like those metas, I felt like I had. Maybe less PT2, but I had, I could express myself better as a player. There was more room for creativity. There was more to figure out. I kind of felt like, I don't know. I just enjoyed them a lot more. But like you said, it's hard to say right now. But let's talk about why this meta looks like a freaking hero soup right now. So go ahead, Hayden.
Well, I just want to say, I guess if you want to talk about, because I felt like you were kind of but trying to find the words in terms of like what is making it feel like this. And a lot of it is, you go and look at the deck list right now. We've actually moved to a point where the deck lists also look a bit more homogenous than they have previously. We're in a meta where almost everyone's playing a certain amount of generics, to combat certain strategies or to play in a certain way. And I think we didn't actually necessarily see that as much at PT1 and PT2. It was a lot more about the class cards, and I think the power level was a little bit higher. Obviously, Alice has made that decision to bring the power level back down a little bit to a degree in terms of just the synergistic nature of the heroes and what the decks are doing. When you look at something like Prism and Spectre, you look at Chain and Soul Shackles and things like that. Darbo, of course. But I think that means that these generics have a better place. So E-Strikes, Oasis, Sync Belows, NC, of course. Which just makes some of the playpens feel a little bit similar. I honestly think that's what it is. But I will say, one thing I do like about how diverse these top 8s have been is that it means that people can really play the things they want and find the lanes to be in. And, you're not dealing with necessarily metas where it's like you have these. And I know this has been a criticism for you, Brennan. You really don't like the idea of like 80, 90 in matchups, right?
Yeah.
You've been pretty, whereas I'm a bit more of like, I kind of like those. I like having those in the game. I think they're good for the game. But what I will say is we're in a format where we don't have that as much. There's maybe very few of them, if any at all. And I think that's what's giving people a lot of enjoyment of how wide these metas are, is because they feel like they can play the hero. They, maybe at worst a 40%er into these matchups, and that's a good feeling. It feels like there's play to it, which is, I agree, is definitely a feel good. I actually think it's maybe not as necessarily as good for competitive scene, but I think that's okay to be in that sort of period now where we're kind of moving through. I think we've gone through these these phases where we went through this really high power phase with Tails, Varia, and Monarch, and we're kind of coming out the other side of it. And I think this is like a stabilization period. And then I think we're going to see the game change a little bit more as we head forward with, Dust Till Dawn, the reintroduction of talent, because talent feels like it's not as relevant right now as it has been previously. The reason I say that is you look at Lexi, which is probably seen as a top deck right now. People are playing it pretty untalented, right? They're focusing on just the value of the arrows right now. But I think with Dust Till Dawn, for instance, we'll see some of these talents become a bit more relevant again. And I think that'll add more interest back into maybe what the format looks like. So I'm really optimistic. I know we've talked about Hero Pie and the sort of health of the format and not being correlated. We've talked about that a lot. We've had a lot to say about that. We've said it over the years. And I agree with you. Still feel the same.
Yeah, so let's go result to result here. So one thing I want to say is I've seen a lot of specialists sort of rise up in this meta, by the way. So people that play specific decks, they seem to be having success with this deck. So, we talk about Brody Spurlock winning on Azalea, but previously to that, Levi Rauch was playing a lot of Azalea and actually saw success on a Battle Hardened. I know Mara Ferris has been doing well with Jermai, kind of a Jermai truther for quite a while. And you see other players doing well with Jermai as well. The thing is like, it's funny how I think that prior to the most recent tournament, you looked at like, East Coast Midwest a tournament versus like a West Coast tournament. They were vastly different. But anyway, on to the results. Let's talk about the first one. So this is Chicago Brawl, the $5,000 one. Brody Spurlock comes in first on Azalea. Number 2, Azalea, Icelander, Azuri, Dash, Lexi, Oldhim, Briar. And then we go to the most recent tournament, which is Oldhim, Jermai, Azalea, Azuri, Alexi, Bravo, Dash. So just a lot being represented. My original thesis as soon as Outsiders came out that Icelander would criminally follow the meta seems to have come to fruition, Hayden. I have to mention. Talk to me. I think Icelander is still a very, very powerful deck. So why is it not showing up? I want to start there. What's wrong with Icelander? Why people hopped off the deck and why is it not being successful?
So I think you look at representation, not just top 8s, which is interesting. So for example, if we look at Richmond over the weekend, our most recent set of results that people are going to really be looking to as we head towards the Pro Tour next weekend, 2 weeks apart. Jermai is the number 1 most played deck. Yep. And then Lexi, and then Ultim, and then Azalea, Bravo, then Azuri, etc., etc. Icelander, 2 copies of the 91 players. 2 people picked it up. And I think the big reason for that is the struggles into Ranger, the prominence of Dromai because people just think Dromai is good. It's pretty popular typically in that part of the world as well, in North America, and the sort of perceived matchup of Dromai into Rangers and the kind of rise of Rangers, right? So, and Dromai is pretty reasonable to Rangers, right? It has this good game plan that Rangers struggles to deal with. So I think that is all these things have contributed to Icelander's fall. Is Icelander a bad deck? No, I think Icelander is still really, really strong, and I think there's ways to look at Icelander to specifically against the Rangers, I think, which could give Icelander enough tools to still be positioned pretty near the top. The question becomes is it enough? And then if I'm looking at that, should you just be playing Ultim or, maybe even Dromai, for instance? And I think that's what people are sort of making the decision about right now. So I expect we'll see some Icelander. I think people will come with some innovations, especially people who like Icelander, like the play patterns. I mean, it's such a consistent deck, so it's always going to be viable as long as you can find the game plans to deal with what you think is going to be at the top of the meta. But I think it's going to be reasonably lowly represented comparative to the last few events. So
over the past few pods, you and I have, I guess, either explicitly or implicitly said that Ultim is the best deck. Do you still, obviously Ultim, it was a double Ultim final recently. Do you still think that to be true? Do you still think Ultim will be the most represented deck? And do you think that it is going to be the most fundamentally powerful deck at the Pro Tour?
Yeah, I do. And let me give you the kind of reasoning, because I think it's pretty straightforward, the reason for this. And it stems back to what I just said about the format before, about the kind of diversity of the format. The format has come from this really powerful place of Monarch and Tails of Varia, like we talked about, and the power level as the synergistic nature of the heroes and just the raw power of the heroes has kind of come down. So we're now focused more on the power level of cards rather than the power level of heroes. And that really suits Ultim. Ultim has really good matchup spreads. It's pretty tight. It never has a really bad matchup. It has great access to really strong blues that allow it to have consistency. It has good attacks that provide disruption. It has a good hero ability that provides disruption as well as flexibility. And it also can be built flexible Plus, it has this card called Crown of Seats and this card called Ramp Up. So Ultim is still in a really, really good position. Is it like outright just the best deck? I think that's going to depend on what the metagame looks like. I think something else could be better positioned depending on what shows up. So there might be a better meta call, which means that it's a better deck for the event. But I think Ultim is just the best deck in terms of just in a vacuum. It just gives you, I think, probably the best matchup spread, which is really interesting. Now, saying that, maybe everyone sort of knows that and they target it, and everyone shows up with Lexi, for instance, and I don't know, Control Dash, let's say, like full on Control Dash. Then all of a sudden, that's much less a field for the old wants to play in. But I think it's
the old layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. It's I want to ask you about another deck. And
is it Dramai?
It's not. It's actually Dash. What do you think about Dash in this meta? Because one of the things I think is most interesting about the Dash deck is the same paradigm that exists with the Ultim deck, which is when you play against a Dash, how do you sideboard? Vastly different decks you could be playing against. And it's even worse than against Ultim because we're talking vastly different decks. Do you think the Dash potentially has room to be like well positioned in this meta? I know that some people say this like Wombat or whatever the hell they call this Dash deck. Tree Frog. Fatigue Dash is, struggles into Dramai and stuff like that. But against, potentially something like Oldhim where it's assembling Exodia and defense reactions against Azalea, it seems like it could be potentially decently well positioned. Maybe not at Richmond because it was Dramai Fest. But, if I'm a Dramai player and I look at the Richmond results, doesn't look too good, Hayden. Doesn't look like Dramai is not a great conversion.
No, and it hasn't been so just to start on Dramai, it hasn't been for the last two events, both at the Brawl and in Richmond. And those, look, there has been other events. I want to point out that the only Battle Hardened we've had is Richmond. The Brawl event wasn't a Battle Hardened. We did have other events happening on the West Coast at the same time. We've had other events, regional events in Europe, Asia. But these are the results we have. This is where the focus has been because there was coverage and there was quite a heavy player base there. So Dramai has not had the results. Like it's put decks into top 8, but it's been first or second most played at both of these events. And you look at the decks that are around like third or fourth, had a better conversion. So, but it's still putting. It's putting decks into top 8. It's still putting up results. So I think it is important to note that it's not just like it's not the old Prism adage from sort of a year and a half ago when it was like Prism is the most played deck and it's like 2% of the wins or whatever in Road to National season.
Illusion. It's the illusionist.
The illusion of illusionist.
Exactly. Go ahead.
Dash though. On the Dash point, it's interesting because I think if you make the meta call to show up with this Control Dash deck, then, presumably you're targeting Ultim and maybe you feel like you have a good Ranger matchup. I don't know that it does have a good Ranger matchup, by the way, when it comes to Azalea, because I think there's only so many defense reactions in your deck and, you to set up items, you have to potentially leak damage, and Azalea can present damage every single turn. It's so consistent. So I don't actually know on that matchup. I think both sides, players who've practice both sides, I could see it being a 60-60 matchup, the classic, where like the Azalea player's like, nah, it's fine, you can throw enough damage, and the Dash player's like, nah, it's fine, you have enough defense to like set up your board state and get through the game. So I could see either side feeling favored. And I think that's going to be ultimately whether Dash is good enough or not. Like my thought is that Dash is not in a good spot in this format right now. I think if you show up with the control sort of build, you're just really susceptible to getting blown out by people just still playing aggro because people will still find reasons to play aggro. I think Briar is a really good choice for this upcoming PT. And then also, how good is your actual matchup into Ultim and Azalea? And I'm sure there'll be some Dash control stands out there who tell me it's really good, and I believe them. My experience has not been that it's been overwhelmingly great, though. So
there are more stands that exist now in Flesh and Blood than there ever have been. There are people that are holding true to their deck because every deck it does seem like these decks are all really playable. But you talk about 60-60 matchups. I think we're in the era of 90-90 where like there's a bunch of people who just think that their deck is
that's ridiculous though.
Their deck is just the best deck. Okay. So we talk about Azalea, but what do you think about Lexi? We've seen Lexi represented these top 8s. Is there, Lexi goes a bit wider, of course. What kind of choices are what kind of decisions are you weighing up? I think is a better way to phrase it. When possibly making the choice between something like Lexi and between Azalea. Like, what meta calls are you making to try to exploit with Lexi instead of Azalea? Because Azalea seems to be the better performing deck so far, and maybe the more represented deck. What does Lexi offer that Azalea doesn't?
So is it the better performing deck? Because both top 8s had Lexi and Azalea represented. I will give you Azalea obviously won that event, the first event. But let's just remove Brody Spurlock from the equation for a second. Let's just take him out of the top 8s.
Then
Lexi had a better performance.
It would be 1-2 technically. So right now it's 3-2, but 2 of those are Brody Spurlock. So if we delete Brody Spurlock, then yes, Lexi does look like a better Ranger deck.
I'm sure some people would like to do that to give themselves a better chance in North America.
Yeah.
I think the consideration for whether you play Lexi is meta. So if you want a better Ultim and a better Dramai matchup, then you probably play Lexi, I think as we've developed in this metagame and people have realized, Azalea is real. It is a top contending deck. It is a very good aggressive deck that presents questions, presents on-hit effects that are really, you can have some massive turns with Azalea. Ultims have adapted. They've adapted to find the right builds that can, because Ultim has the tools to do it. On the other hand, though, Lexi can go really wide. It can cause a lot of problems. It abuses 2 of the most powerful cards that Ranger has access to in the form of Rain Razors and 3 of a Kind, which have just all of a sudden kind of been forgotten a little bit, I think. So I think, and Lexi was the second most played deck in Richmond, which is surprising because as much as I think that Lexi's good, did everyone know that? Has everyone had Lexi on the radar? I think the answer is no, which means Lexi's probably going to be even more played come, say, at least the Calling in Baltimore, if not the Pro Tour, I think.
Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah. So I was just thinking about that point. If it's the second most represented deck with only 1 top 8, maybe that doesn't bode as well for the conversion, but that could just be the amount of Dramai that showed up, I guess, potentially. Talk to me about Azuri. There seems to be an Azuri creeping into these top 8s every single time, but this looks like a deck to me that, if we had a sort of scale for decks that I believe in, I think that Azuri would probably on the bottom.
I mean, you look at the conversion. Azuri has a bit of conversion than into top 8 than Dramai.
It's like the Kano conversion was
Azalea.
What was it, 30%?
Yeah. But that said, I mean, the reason I think we've seen Azuri in these 2 top 8s is that it's a really technical deck, I think, and people have probably, if you're playing on Teleshow, you're probably getting some reps into Azuri, but the Azuri list can look wildly different, and I think it reminds me a little bit of Dorinthia from Welcome to Wraith. It reminds me a little bit of Bolton from Monarch. If you don't have the reps playing into it, it can be really, really difficult to play into it. People will make incorrect decisions when it comes to ending. They won't have the right game plan to punish sort of Azuri's weaknesses. And I think, Azuri is solid, I would say. It is maybe somewhere in that sort of tier 2 region, I think, maybe tier 3, but it bumps itself up by just, I think, having access to tools that are hard to deal with and maybe the opponent not knowing how to deal with it. And I think that's why it's seeing some success, to be honest. So I think it has a little bit of the Dorinthia syndrome.
Do we need to talk about Bravo?
Probably. I think.
Why would you play Bravo?
Ranger, right? I think that's why you play Bravo, is probably for Ranger. Now the problem is, do you have a better or worse Dramai matchup? Probably the same. Ultim feels like a really tough matchup for you. That's traditionally been really favored for Ultim. But I mean, if you feel like you have a good matchup into Ranger and Dramai, and that's looking like it might be 40% of the meta, Bravo is back on the table, right?
Yeah. So
even if you do just think it's a worse Ultim, then it's
yeah. I was gonna say, do you think that you think there's situations where it's a better, I think there are situations, if the meta was, and I know this is not the case, of course, but if the meta was mono Fi, I think that in that case maybe Bravo is a better Oldhim. But against these other decks, I still think that the Oldhim, the tempo oriented Oldhim deck, is just a better Bravo deck because of its access to Crown of Seeds and just a much larger card pool. What do you think?
So I guess the Crippling Crush is it always comes back to Crippling Crush, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, the Dominate effect.
If it didn't come back, let's be real. Bravo's hero ability, it's not Oldham's hero ability. So yeah, you have some specialization cards. Is Crippling Crush enough of an art? Is it compelling enough?
I think it's going to be meta dependent. I think it's probably not quite. It's kind of been always, I know we've gone back and forth on this. You've been pretty adamant over the sort of through our podcast that Oldhim is just the better Guardian, I think. And I've been I've flipped and flopped. Sometimes I've agreed with you, sometimes I've disagreed with you. I think all in all, it is right, but I do still think there is times where Crippling Crush and access to dominate and the play patterns is going to be really relevant. I don't know if Baltimore and this meta is one of them, but you know what? If Lexi is the second most played deck, and maybe you do have a better Dromai matchup than Ultim, maybe because of Crippling Crush, because of the on tap dominate, then maybe that is what you need and what you want.
Yeah, so one of the main reasons why I think that Bravo is a boomer hero is because, I honestly, the one time, this is a funny story, because the one time that Hayden and I maybe flip-flopped on this whole discussion was when he thought that Ultim was obviously better, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to play Bravo instead, and I went and played Bravo at a Battle Hardened. But yeah, the reason why I think that Bravo in particular is a boomer flesh and blood hero is because nowadays the decks that Bravo is really good against, or should be, like Fi, like Briar, these aggro decks, these on-hit effects or preventing them playing cards, they have fridges now. And like, that's just, it's really good. Like Briar can block a Crippling Crush, and that's BS. Like, I think that that's just kind of crazy. And that's the hardest part about Bravo is like the game exists on such a fine line, and then you try to pivot with something like Crippling Crush and it gets blocked by an entire fridge. And then, you're being presented with 35 something damage from like a Channel Mod Heroic. It's tough. It's tough to exist in the day and age where aggro decks have access to armor that was previously only available to, control decks.
I don't disagree with you. I think Ultim is probably going to be the better pick, but Bravo's on the table because I think Guardian's in a good spot right now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about aggro, because what is aggro in this meta? And I think if you look at the results from Richmond, it looks like it's the Rangers. It's Lexi, it's Azalea, and then a bit of Katsu and Briar. Those look like that is why aggro is in this format, which makes sense. So we've gone from this kind of these aggro decks that are a bit more sort of power weapon into really focus sort of either go wide or go tall through attack actions. And abusing sort of some above rate cards, or significantly above rate cards, 3 of a kind, Rain Razors when it comes to Lexi, and Codex as well. Lexi still plays Codex and makes a really good use of it as well. But then for Azalea, Codex, Premeditate, the Lace Widths, just the overrateness of the arrows, and Death Dealer. You're abusing Death Dealer because that replaces itself. But what does the other aggro of options look like? Because I think the part of the reason Dromai has been so heavily played is it's like, okay, you have a pretty good matchup into Ranger, and what are the other aggro decks that you're worried about? And I think that's honestly why people have defaulted to playing Dromai, especially if people think they have a good Ultim matchup. Look, I'm not going to get into this debate again. You can bring Tarek back on the pod if you want to talk about that. But I think we're going to see a bit of a rise of other aggro decks, of these more weapon-based aggro decks that we haven't seen in a while. So I think Katsu isn't it, unfortunately, as much as I would love to say that Katsu is great and Katsu looks exciting. It's not quite there. Briar, on the other hand, is still really, really powerful. And it's been pretty underrepresented, I would say, at these last 2 events. I think heading into both the PT and the calling, I think we're going to see more of it. And I think it's poised to do well. I think people have to have the right builds. They have to understand how they want to play into ranges in particular. And if Lexi's on the rise, that can be difficult, especially if they're going to have some amount of ice, which it doesn't look like. Just to be clear, these Lexi decks look pretty useless. They look more focused on value, leveraging 3 of a kind, Rain Razors, Codexes, etc. But Channel Man Heroic is still amazing. Rosetta is still amazing, and you block really well, which is good against Rangers. So I would be playing Briar, I think, if I was going to. That's what my testings led me to.
So let's put it on a little bit of a, like, if we're evaluating the meta over the course of these results rolling in, I think that if Icelander, in the early days of this meta was like a heavily represented deck, that'd be a reason why I would be like, yeah, Briar, I'm not too sure about it. Despite what you or I might think about that matchup specifically, we look at the World Championships as sort of a poster of the result. Icelander,
sucks.
Yeah, Icelander is good into Briar. But, as Icelander gets forced out of the meta from decks like Azalea, you now have opportunity to come back in and Briar is a potential pick, but second most played deck is Lexi. How do you feel playing into that deck? And is that most recent data point, Lexi being the second most played deck, does that make you waver at all on your Briar pick?
Oh yeah, a little bit, but I think based on the list that we're seeing, these lists that are a bit more, they're less fuseless, they're less ice focused. Because what traditionally killed you in that matchup as Briar was the fact that you could deal with kind of the on hits and some of the value and them having big 3 of a kind turns, because you have your own big turns to have. What absolutely destroyed you though is when they have like, um, chilling into an endless arrow
Blizzard
and they get back
Bolt
endless
and
arrow.
like, it's just
Yeah. Mostly chilling. That's the one that
Discard
really
your
crushes you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're really hard. You can't choose when you have your big turns. When they're just presenting damage, you can choose when you have those big turns, and you defend pretty well. So you can defend on other turns. You can stop the kind of repetitive nature of cards like Endless Arrow. You can stop some of the above rate things like Protecting Shot, for instance. There is a lot of good cards they have access to now, which means that just the power level in total is better. So Codex, for instance, is obviously a big upgrade there that helps the consistency as well. So I think the power level might have gone up, the disruption's gone down, and where that balances out for the matchup is the toughest part. I would say the matchup feels better than it did before when they're more focused on kind of the disruption element, because just like I said, you get to choose your spots. But I think it's tough still. But if I look through, Dromai, feel good about that matchup. I like the ultimate matchup as a Briar player. That's a good matchup for Briar.
90-90.
And then, well, I don't think it's that good, but I think it's favored for Briar. And then you've got Azalea afterwards, and I think kind of what I've been looking at as that matchup, and I think there's ways to have a good matchup as Briar with them. So
yeah, I mean, makes sense. I'm really interested to see where we land in terms of like how would you break down the layer 1, layer 2 metagaming? Do you think that, because we look at Ultim as being the best deck, do you think that most people are going to default to layer 1 and be on the best deck, or how many people do you think, in what proportion, I think is a better way of phrasing it, do you think will respond and try to play some counter deck? Because in past Pro Tours, the top 3 decks were pretty predictable, and the top deck in particular was quite predictable. So I think it was very reasonable to go layer 2 and play the deck that beats the deck. And even so reasonable that it made a little bit of sense if you were cooking something up in your testing group that, you could go layer 3 because you're like, this is so obvious that there's this deck that absolutely counters this, this best deck. Where do you think that Pro Tour Baltimore will land?
Whether people do this consciously or subconsciously, I think that it's a little bit different to past Pro Tours. I think at past Pro Tours, the power level of decks has been really evident. So let's take PT2, right? Power level of Prism and what that does and how it interacts with decks like Ultim, for instance. The power level of a deck like Briar in that format and what it does. And even to an extent, the power level of, let's say, Ultim in that format. Like I think they were really clear. Or you go to PT1, Chain, Prism, Savo. It was really clear how powerful these heroes were over and above. We don't have that. That's what I'm saying. The power level is a lot closer right now. But I think this kind of idea that people will think that Ultim is clearly by far and away the best deck. I don't think it's going to happen. But what people will think is they'll actually look to consistency as a form of power. And what are the most consistent decks in this format? Well, Ultim is one of those. So it elevates it to a very good deck. But because of the closeness of things, I don't think that people are going to have this idea of these overwhelming, far and away best decks, right? So I think what that means is that the players are going to look for what feels, go a bit more by feel rather than just pure sort of numbers and results. What feels better, what feels like it has more raw power, and what has consistency. And I mean, those decks are kind of at the top of what we saw in Richmond last week. Like it's Ultim, it's Dromai, it's Ranger.
Yeah, in a vacuum, I would lean towards picking Oldham for this Pro Tour because of the good matchup spread, and I think that it's baseline the most powerful deck, has access to some of the best cards. I do think that people will show up on a variety of I think that the diversity of decks that show up will be greater than it has been in past Pro Tours. So I think that matchup spread would be very important to me in a tournament like that. That being said, I preface that by saying in a vacuum because if you were cooking up a Briar deck and you're like, hey, here's this Briar deck, yeah, I'd probably pick that up. Let's be real. It wouldn't be an Arsenal, it wouldn't be an Arsenal Pass podcast unless we talked about Kano at the Pro Tour. So Kano at the Pro Tour looks like garbage because all these decks are playing Oasis or Spite against Azalea, right? Like it's not. And also we talked about the Kano parable. Trying to trying what metas it's good into. Let's just go short and short of it. This is the worst kind of meta, just in terms of like what might show up, all that stuff, and then also the ultimate, the sort of the trap card against Kano is just being put in decks because of another deck anyway.
So we talked about Kano last week. I don't think anything's changed on that regard, but I will proposition you with one other hero, Brennan.
Yes?
Reiner.
Oh, come on.
So, look, I'm not saying to everyone go and play Rhino, but if we're doing the old can you play Kano in this format, then I'm going to do the old can you play Rhino in this format. I haven't said it in a while. I'm going to revive it. And I do think if you are looking for a time to play Rhino, this kind of format is a lot more advantageous to it than a format where ninjas are great, Runeblades are great. A format where you've got Guardians, Illusionists, and Rangers, that's a lot more profitable a format for Rhino. Now, if you're out there saying, okay, how do I even do this if I want to play Rhino right now? My advice would be club.
Yeah.
Look at club and look at sort of some really value-orientated sort of deck builds that have good defensive options. Play a really old-school kind of grindy Rhino, almost semi-combo finish deck with Intimidate. And I think there's something there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to spend time on it because I've fallen down that trap so many times, and I think Rhino fundamentally just isn't quite powerful enough.
Exactly. Right.
Doesn't have enough of the consistency of powerful cards, but I do think that, Rhino is in a much, much better spot than it has been for a lot of other events previously.
So
Would I play it? No, but,
I think Rhinos are historically, it always depends on the deck build, historically quite a synergistic deck. And I think that, one of the things we talked about in this meta is that, the deck colored pie or the hero pie might be diverse, but the decks feel a bit samey, because there's a lot of cards that are making it into all the same deck lists. Like we've had a bit of power creep, and it does feel like there's cards that are just better than other cards. I think Rhino as a deck, when built synergistically, how has been in the past, is just like, it's just consistently underpowered. Just like the cards are underrated to what we're seeing dominate the meta right now. So I think that's probably the crux of the issue. But there's always there's something there. There's potentially something there. Who knows? Maybe there's a combo deck that will show up. What would make me happy? You asked me a question about casting. I don't know. It's definitely last pod. But what would make me the happiest at something like the Pro Tour as a caster is for a deck like Kano at PT1 to show up. A combo deck that people are not anticipating, that just uses a few cards that are traditionally used and is able to pull off something that people didn't think was previously possible. That is the most exciting thing for me to watch at a tier 4 level event where people can really reap the rewards of a deck like that. The effort it takes to find, if they even exist in a game like Fab, which is, obviously because of the algorithm, they're very unlikely.
Bolton is going to show up at Baltimore.
Which one?
Bolton at Baltimore.
Bolton? Yeah, that one. The one where you just draw cards. I'm sorry. I hate Bolton. I do like combo Oldhim though. The fatigue Oldhim list where you combo them by just blocking all your cards, and then combo they're fatigued.
All right. Well, last thing I want to say, just to finish up on Rhino quickly, I just pulled up I had brainstormed this deck list, so if people are looking for some ideas for looking at Rhino. My list has 12 defense reactions, 9 barrage and beatdown, 9 smash instinct, 6 savage swing. Looks pretty. It's club. So that's the build.
All right. Anything else to close out with before we finish up this one?
No, I don't think so. I'm really looking forward to. Obviously, we have another pod before we head into Baltimore, so we will talk a little bit more about, I guess, kind of the finishing of testing and what to expect. I think for the weekend. It's going to be a very interesting event. This meta kind of musical chairs continues a little bit in terms of where decks are, Lexi really rising last weekend. Dromai still sitting in there somehow. Oldhim sort of bouncing around. The aggro deck's really on the downtrend. It's going to be interesting.
Yep. I don't think we mentioned this week, but if you do want to get your question read on the podcast for the Command and Cookout session, shoot us a comment on YouTube. Actually interested to hear on YouTube what you all think the meta will look like for Pro Tour Baltimore. I think that the answers will be quite different. I think we'll have a diversity of answers because everybody's got an opinion, and this meta I think is the most unclear by far. So interested to hear your thoughts on Pro Tour Baltimore meta predictions. Anyway, we're both on Twitter. I'm at Brendan APG. Hayden is at Finn_Dale. Check out the Arsenal Pass Patreon. We got some deck techs up there. Brody Spurlock we talked about, the Battle Hardened Menace, did an Azalea deck tech with us and has a sideboard guide, tips and tricks, all that kind of stuff on Patreon. So check that out. And until next week, see you later.
Yep.